Hi, everyone. For today's lecture on the anthropology of sport, I thought I would bring it to you pretend from Citi Field, home of the New York Mets baseball team. So today we're going to be talking about sports and why they are so important to so many people around the world. Now, first off, a sport is a competitive activity performed for an audience. Sometimes they're physical, but more and more esports are becoming popular, electronic sports like online gaming and things like that. So it doesn't always have to be physical, but sports always have to be competitive and they always have to have an audience. This is why they're different from games, right? Games are also competitive, but they don't require an audience, where sports are performed for people watching. And this is viewed as leisure, but like this is huge business in the US and abroad. Like sports make a ton of money. Esports make a ton of money, more than movies, more than, film or theater or anything like that. So sports are an incredibly big business around the world, and especially in the United States. Now, we should ultimately understand that sport is about conflict. Sport is a way of channeling aggression and a way of having mock conflict between people in a society and then between societies, right? So we have national sports, and national sports are all about values. So when we look at whatever sport is the national sport of a place, we can actually understand a lot about their values. For example, in Japan, the national sport is baseball. And this is because Japan is a society that really emphasizes perfection and attention to detail. And baseball is the statistician sport. It is based on precision and attention to detail. Whereas the passionate and high energy Latin Americans love football with its arc, its grace, its artistry, its high energy. What about the Aussies and New Zealander Kiwis, who are rough and tumble and known as kind of being, abrasive frat boy type as a society? Well, of course, they love rugby. As a rugby player myself in college, I can tell you it is the rough bastards sport. Now, the US, we have a variety of different sports, but what is the one that is uniquely American in terms of our big four sports? That's basketball. And it is very much the showman's sport, right? It's the Michael Jordan, everybody knows your brand, everybody knows your name sport. Very American. And then you have like weird national sports like Buzkashi, which is the national sport of Afghanistan, where guys ride around on horses carrying a sewn up goat that's had its head pulled off. And then they try to like fling the goat into a specially marked area where the other guys on horses are simultaneously trying to beat you and knock you off your horse. So pretty indicative of the rough and tumble and highly violent and tribal nature of Afghan culture. So national sports in many ways can help us to understand the values of that nationality. And that's because they express those values through the practicing, through the logistics of the sport itself. So look at the United States, right? Our certain values of discipline, dedication, excellence, etc., are shown through sports. But we also use sports as a way to show our public values. That's why there's so much patriotism and respect for armed forces, why there are so many like sports initiatives that are oriented towards promoting certain values. This is also why people get all sorts of clusterfucked upset when people kneel at the national anthem at a sporting event. Because in many ways in America, sporting events are about showing your patriotism more than anything else. So anything that is deemed unpatriotic doesn't belong in sports, which is exactly why it is so important for people to protest at sporting events, because sporting events are about our values. And if we're talking about our values changing, then that's the place to make that statement. That's a nexus of value and ideology in a performative space. And so sports often help us to understand class conflict. And New York is a great example of this. Chicago is as well. You have two competing baseball teams within the same city, and one of them is the upper class team and one of them is the lower class team. So I'm a Mets fan, that's the lower class team, or like the underdogs or the little brothers. And there are lots of examples of this in American sports. And of course, there are also examples of this in other countries' sports as well. Now, if we're talking about sports as the ultimate channeled aggression, the Olympics are the best example of this. And the Olympics start in ancient Greece, and that's why we have so many beautiful Olympian statues of these wonderfully bodied individuals, by which we mean men, because the original Olympics were about men, being naked and performing various athletic tasks. But the modern Olympics begins in 1896. We used to have, like when I was growing up, we had two Olympics on the same year. So the Winter Olympics and the Summer Olympics were in the same year, and they came every 4 years. Now we alternate them so that every 2 years we have an Olympics. And so there's the summer and the winter and the summer and the winter, and they aren't in the same year. But that's a change since 1992, the Barcelona Olympics. And hosting the Olympics is a big cultural deal. They are essentially a coming out party. It's a way to show that your country has arrived. It's a way of showing that you are democratic and globalized and interact with the rest of the globalized world in a competent and economically solvent way. These are a huge financial gamble. Some of them have been financially incredibly successful, like the Great Britain Olympics in 2012 were incredibly successful for Great Britain, whereas the Sochi Olympics in 2016 were a giant financial clusterfuck because it was Russia, and so there was tons and tons of corruption. And so hosting the Olympics is really a coming out party. In other words, it's not just about the sport, it's really also about the culture. And the greatest example of this is with the 2008 Beijing Olympics. In these Olympics, China really came out as a world power and said, look, we are on the same level and scope as Europe or the United States, etc. And so these were incredibly beautifully choreographed Olympic opening events, and all of the artistic displays were really ornate and impressive. In your Canvas module, I've actually assigned for you guys to watch the opening sequences, the opening part of the Olympic Games in Beijing, just to see how impressive and the scale and scope that they were. But of course, these also can be complete failures, like the Sochi Olympics, the Rio Olympics, etc. And of course, Olympics can be incredibly political. We've had various Olympics canceled because of wars. And of course, this year it's been canceled because of the pandemic, but that's not quite political. You have the Olympics where people, for example, put their fists up to display protests against racial inequality. Or, for example, political groups actually kidnap people and have violence at the Olympics as a way of making a political statement. So the Olympics are themselves both a sporting act, but also a political act. And that's why it's very difficult to separate sports and culture. And that's because sports are highly symbolic, right? They represent our values and they are full of symbols. I mean, mascots themselves are literally symbols. Uniforms are symbols. The images in the stadiums, the images that are used in broadcasts, these are all highly symbolic. And mascots are the best example of this. Mascots are just totems. They're just images that represent that particular tribe. And in many cases, they represent some value, ancestral or founding, etc., that goes together with that team. And so the mascot actually represents the spirit of that city or that location that the team represents. Now, of course, this means that mascots can be incredibly controversial, and especially in the United States, we see controversy surrounding Native American mascots. There are a number of these. However, this really came to a fore this year when the Washington Redskins removed their name Redskins, which is a racial slur and should not be used as a sports name. And at this point, they are the Washington football team, because I suspect they're waiting until after the election. And if Trump wins again, they're going to go back to being the Redskins. So we're going to kind of wait and see. But if Trump doesn't win the election, they probably will pick some other mascot, because just football team is not really effective. But other teams still have Native American names, and this has led to a great deal of controversy. We're going to talk about that this week in discussion. But sports and mascots also tell a lot about other identities, and one of those is occupational identities. A lot of sports teams really represent occupations in an area, and so they're connected to industrialism and agriculture and other industries, right? So the Detroit Pistons, right, representing Motor City, the Milwaukee Brewers, the Pittsburgh Steelers, even the Houston Astros, representing all of the astronauts and other NASA stuff that exists in Houston. So these are ultimately competitions between occupations. Sports teams also often have identity names which represent the place or the character. So the New Orleans Saints represents the French aspect of New Orleans culture, right? Of course, the Minnesota Vikings, because there are so many Scandinavians who settled the territory of Minnesota. This would become the state of Minnesota, so they're represented by the Vikings. In the same way, the Boston Celtics. Boston is a town with a huge number of Irish immigrants, and so they're represented by the Celtics. I am a Metropolitans fan. That's what the Mets are. And they are the Metropolitans. And their icon in the background actually shows 5 buildings representing the 5 boroughs that make up the metropolitan area of New York City. So that's who represents them. And of course, sports also connect to the issue of race. And especially in the United States, sports are highly divided by race. Baseball is actually the one that has the biggest mix, and that's because of the important history of the Negro Leagues in baseball, bringing African American communities into baseball playing and actually allowing them to play in major leagues once the Negro Leagues were finally dissolved. And you also have a lot of Latino players because of the importance of baseball in a number of Latino countries. But sports are often seen as a racial class equalizer, but that is not always the case. If you are a Black football player, you are still expected to smash your head in regularly for the entertainment of the largely white viewing audience. So is this really a class equalizer? Is this really a racial equalizer? That's something worth debating in section. And of course, sports and gender are also an incredibly contentious issue. Inequalities exist in a whole bunch of different ways: branding, opportunity, naming, and of course, the number one is pay. And of course, the US women's soccer team has been at the forefront in pushing for equal pay for the 2 sports, considering that women's soccer brings in more fans, more money, and more championships, but its female players get paid less than their male equivalents. So the pay inequity issue in particular is something that's being dealt with and fought about in soccer in the United States. Ultimately, why are sports important? Because they create a sense of communitas. Communitas is an idea that sociologist Emil Durkheim presented, where he argues we feel some kind of shared community sense that brings us together during certain events, and sports are one of those kind of events. And we actually feel better by going through that experience together. This is done through something he calls collective effervescence. We get swept up in the excitement together, we feel the energy, and we feel better. The best example of this is literally the wave, right? So the wave is a physical manifestation of collective effervescence, but the principle still stands. You're in the park, you feel that energy, like your team does something that scores some points or gets a run on the board or gets a touchdown or whatever, and you feel that energy around you and you're swept up in it, and it feels really, really good. And this is the reason that not having sports during the pandemic has really fucked with us, because part of that need within us during the pandemic is to connect to other people, because we've all been social distancing. And part of the way we connect to other people is through sports and that communitas and that collective effervescence. But when we don't see people in the stands, when we aren't part of the stands ourselves, we lose that communitas right at a time when we need it the most, which is why sports are so important during the pandemic, even though it's really difficult to have them. That's why so many people got upset about sports being delayed, because we thrive off that communitas. We need it. It fuels us. And so sports ultimately serve kind of as a religion. They fill us with faith. They teach us about magic and superstition. Rituals are a major part of sports and superstition as well. So all of these aspects that we talked about in the religion week come into play when it comes to sports. You gotta have faith. You gotta believe, right? And this is because sports are magical. There are lots of unexplained things. And really what it comes down to is, one definition of magic that I really like is that magic is when things go against probability. In other words, when something should have happened and yet the impossible or unlikely happened. That's how we think about magic. And sports is full of that, right? That last minute shot that beats the clock, gets in there after the buzzer's rung, and wins the game. That home run that takes your team out front. That's magical because it beats probability. We don't expect it to happen, and yet it does. And ultimately, sports allow us to believe in miracles. Even the most scientifically minded person can get swept up in that communitas, can believe in something magical for just a little while, and they end up becoming our heroes, right? Sports legends are exactly that. They make us believe and they fulfill that belief, and it's the heroicism that we've finally been looking for in a world that just doesn't have a lot of heroes. And so ultimately, sport fulfills our need to compete, our need to feel an identity and express that identity, a way to reproduce our values and connect them to others, and to feel that communitas and that sense of camaraderie that helps us feel connected to each other. So it allows us to feel connected to people even while we battle them, right? Because at the end of the day, you might have a different team than I have, but we both love the sport the same way, and that's what matters. And so in many ways, sports give us something to believe in, something bigger than ourselves. And that's really exciting and magical and important for anthropologists to study and understand. All right, guys, so that's everything. Hopefully now you can see the importance of sport in anthropology and the way that sports connects to our sense of identity, our sense of faith, and our sense of belonging. Thanks so much for listening.